the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, we do want to mention we do have a Patreon account, patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there, or if not, leave us a nice review on iTunes. We do have one in particular that I'd like get moved down the list, so please consider that for us. Today, Taylor and I are very proud to bring you this week's guest, Renata Salecl. She is senior researcher at the Institute of Criminology in the Faculty of Law at the University of Ljubljana and holds a professorship at Birckbeck College, University of London. Her books include The Spoils of Freedom, Psychoanalysis and Feminism After the Fall of Socialism, On Anxiety, Choice, and her latest book, A Passion for Ignorance, What We Choose Not to Know and Why. But Renata, thank you so much for joining us on this week's edition of the show. We're very excited to have you and dive into your work.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. So we'd like to begin by asking our guests, it's a good question to sort of get things moving and get the thought process sort of going. We kind of pose it as, what would your philosophical origin story be if you have one? So maybe there's an anecdote or, a moment in your life, or maybe just a thinker or book or some person in your life that influenced you to get into philosophy. So if you have something like that, we'd love to hear about it.
I was interested in very early on in high school in philosophy, psychology, and I also very much enjoyed architecture. So it was a big choice between these three subjects. Architecture sort of fell down the list because I didn't see many women architects around, and I was feeling that maybe if I become an architect, probably I will design garages and male architects will design houses. But of course, there were not many philosophers, women philosophers also. However, philosophy won at the end because I saw a lot of people having a fantasy that they will do some kind of, let's say, boring job for, 30, 40 years. And then when they retire, they will read all the books they want to read. Mm-hmm. And I saw that they never realized this dream. So I thought I will first read all the books I'm interested in many philosophical books, so I will retire first. And then whatever happens. I will do whatever job will be necessary to survive.
That's a very practical.
I love it.
That was a risk worth taking. Of course, it was a very non-productive choice. So I was pleased that my parents were supportive.
Good.
Although, they knew that, it might not lead to any kind of career which would, provide for good life.
And you've proven that wrong, though, right?
Yes, exactly. I have proven them. Yeah, I have proven them. And they were always saying to all the other parents, allow the child to study whatever, even if it's philosophy like my daughter did.
No, that's incredible. And I brought this up to you before the show that one of the anecdotes you have in the book is in relation to the fact that there's a Wikipedia page for everything. We can Google. Information is supposedly at our fingertips at any moment, where we're not supposed to be ignorant of any phenomenon in the world. That's up to us, so to speak. And yet you kind of juxtapose that sort of instantaneous knowledge gratification versus and I assume you're not the only one. I assume this is a very common theme, your dive into the critique of pure reason and how you at first were rebuffed, but kind of sat with it and sat with that not knowing and use that kind of to drive you to learn more and to grapple with not knowing. And something about this being able to sit with not knowing, not it being an instantaneous sort of epiphany, is something that perhaps is going to be more and more lost in this sort of explosion of information.
Yes, and here I must remember again my parents, when I made my choice to study philosophy, they said, you really should think long and hard, because we are not going to pay, the next year for some other study. So,
right.
If you choose philosophy, you need to finish the year. And that's when I sort of realized this enormous responsibility to go through, really difficult books. So one of my exams was Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And to get that book in your hands when you are 18 years old, it's very anxiety provoking, and especially before internet. So you read 50 pages, you don't understand anything, you don't know exactly what to do. And then, of course, you get some book about Kant, which explains a little bit, what
right.
the book is really about. But nonetheless, then you have to dive into this very long, complicated book, and read it a couple of times and then, pass the exam. And I think that today, with all the distractions, we don't deal with this necessary anxiety,
right.
necessary in front of the unknown, in the way that helps us kind of, let's say, expand our mind, kind of getting our, understanding of text to the point that we kind of feel more and more comfortable with them, because we can immediately disappear. We can immediately switch when we feel uncomfortable in front of a complicated text. And that's, I think, what is a real problem today with our concentration, and also enduring anxiety, because anxiety is also something positive. When we have stage fright, is positive in a way that we feel a little bit of anxiety, not too much, but
yes.
And also anxiety in front of what we don't understand, complicated texts that require us to think and, kind of spend some time with it. And I think that we are losing that. And that's something that we unfortunately now have to fight with all kinds of self-binding mechanisms to, let's say, leave our mobile phone in another room or switch off the internet when we are writing.
That is exactly right. It'd be easier instead of reading through, Kant or secondary literature to grasp it, or any other thinker. I'm thinking, for me, it's more like Hegel, but I find Kant sometimes to be a little bit easier, depending on the case. But it'd be easier just to distract oneself on the phone, or even, just to try to, again, read a summary or Spark Notes or a Wikipedia page. And that can only give you the rudiments. But what you're talking about is something more delicate. It is something more akin to working with and working through the anxiety and the uncertainty and the non-knowledge, and groping about to a certain extent, and being okay with that instead of the fear of not mastering immediately.
So another anecdote, a few years ago, I had a graduate student in philosophy who decided to write his PhD, the first version of PhD, by hand.
Okay.
He wanted to kind of escape the temptations on computer. He disconnected internet in the room where he was writing PhD, and also allowed himself the mobile phone use only in some rooms, not in the one he was writing.
Did that pay off? Did that work out?
Yes. Actually, at the end, he did retype it, and he passed successfully.
Good. There you go. That's a tip. That's a pro tip that I think I might have to use at certain points, when I can get distracted when trying to read, either for the show or when editing translation, something like this. It's much easier just to get distracted from the constant influx, the constant possibility. There's infinite possibilities just at your fingertips. And I think that's another sort of consequence of this explosion of information.
The unconscious is always groping for something like
right. The ego is sending out its little pseudopodia. Out.
That's funny. I hadn't thought about that so much, but yeah, that's so true. I was, same thing. I have my laptop reading your book, and then I've got my phone in my laptop, and I'm looking at my Twitter account. I'm so many of these characters in your book, Renata.
Oh, thank you.
I think especially, Taylor brought up not exactly this, but I think imposter syndrome is definitely something that or like faking it till you make it. I think in particular, because we are, Taylor and I are engaging week to week with difficult readings oftentimes. And, thinkers like yourself, obviously that it can be, that's an a little bit of anxiety inducing. A little bit of that is fine, but too much, maybe is not so good. But yeah, it's an interesting, something that I can very much identify with, I suppose, in just trying to find the balance between feeling confident enough to engage with people. Obviously, we have no idea who the audience is,
I'm all for, a little bit of anxiety. And I think that the imposter syndrome, one should also not perceive it at only negative,
right.
Just to explain to the audience that in the 70s, the imposter syndrome was invented when, psychologists observed that a lot of women were feeling that they will be found out when they succeed, that someone will, discover that they are not as good as they look, not as smart, not as, sort of accomplished. And they had this anxiety, which in some way shows us that, what in Lacanian psychoanalysis we call the big other, the big other still exists, which means that we are still worried about how we are appearing in the broader social setting. And that kind of a feeling, I'm not the one, who appears on the outside, this kind of an anxiety, I think, is very much linked to the fact that we are split subjects and full of doubt, the one who really, thinks that he is a king or a master, an incredibly powerful person. That person might lack, this essential doubt and, might have a kind of a untriggered psychotic structure. And unfortunately, today's capitalism very much encourages this idea of self-confident leader, and someone who does not have doubt. And unfortunately, quite a lot of politicians who are, let's say, succeeding in drawing big crowd around them, the kind of, let's say, contemporary populist politicians, they quite often also appear as people without anxiety and without doubt. And of course, when we are full of anxiety, we are often searching for someone with whom to identify.
Something to prop ourselves on.
Yes, and unfortunately, we are allowing, these people who are lacking the feeling of doubt, the feeling of guilt, have this kind of a narcissistic structure to become, powerful leaders in industry and in politics.
I think this is great. I did appreciate that chapter because I didn't know that the origin of that term, imposter syndrome, was first kind of crafted around, successful women. So I didn't know that it had feminist origins. And so understanding that actually gave a lot more context. But also in what you just said, it makes kind of sense in terms of the master or the subject supposed to know. There's this interesting, like in the diagrams about the 4 diagrams, you can think of the master's discourse. The master doesn't need to know. He just wants things to work, right? So there is a kind of ignorance on the master side. It's the so-called slave in the field of knowledge who's producing knowledge. And as long as that there's some sort of surplus, the master doesn't need that knowledge just for that surplus to accumulate. So it is kind of interesting, just off the top of my head, seeing ignorance in that sphere. And yet at the same time, as you point out, there is this portrayal of mastery in populism. And you give obviously the example in the States of Donald Trump. There is this sense of a learned ignorance in a different sense that he portrayed as being a layman, being everyman, by sort of a chauvinism of his lack of knowledge instead of, his mastery of everything, at least pretending to just everything is known, but at the same time, not knowing became almost a boon for him.
Exactly. And it happened already before Trump that being ignorant is something that you can be proud of, or you can become a celebrity because of your ignorance. So you are not ashamed anymore,
Right.
for your lack of knowledge or even your lack of interest to I remember years ago in the UK when the Big Brother TV show became very popular, there was one contestant from the UK who did not know where the city Cambridge is.
Wow. Okay.
In which country is Cambridge?
Okay.
And she became even more famous after this. Now, why? Because it was so easy for the audience to identify with her. There is some kind of, you're more relaxed about your lacks of knowledge when someone who is so famous, like Trump, for example, or a contestant who was a celebrity in Big Brother, openly admits that she doesn't know something, so basic, like where the city is. I think this started, some time ago, to be proud of your ignorance. And of course, now with the social media, we also have a huge difference in regard of, who is authority for something. So an opinion of an influencer, of course, easily has more followers than any scientific knowledge, produced after decades of work. And we know now that we don't have any agreements on what is a fact, what is truth, which is why in the paperback edition, which just came out of my book, A Passion for Ignorance, I'm going into this problem, the problem of truth today and in the past. And, I think that, let's say, philosophers like Jan Patočka, who very much influenced Václav Havel, playwright, former late president of Czech Republic, they mistakenly believed that, a social change can happen if people will see the truth of how the regime functions, for example. So, Václav Havel, in wonderful short story on the story of the greengrocer, he speaks about, a man who every 1st of May is putting a communist flag and, a poster, workers of the world unite yourself. But he doesn't believe in communism, but he puts this, poster because, the party requires him to do it. And he thinks privately, I don't agree with the party, but doesn't cost me much, to put this slogan in the window of my shop. But Havel's idea is that the regime, might change when people will start speaking the truth, when they will openly say, I don't believe in the regime. Now, things are very much changed now because the regimes today actually play on the idea that people don't believe in anything anymore.
Right.
And they don't expect people to believe in them, I think that to understand these ideological changes today is really important, and that's kind of what has been driving me throughout my career. The biggest question in my life has always been, how do people identify with ideology? How does that ideology grasp them, and of course helps a continuation of some regime. In the past, I lived in the socialist regime of former Yugoslavia. The ideology there was very different than the ideology later of kind of, let's say, neoliberal capitalism, which happened after, the collapse of socialism. But nonetheless, you could see some similarities in the ideologies before and today. In some way, both very much kind of relied also on certain apathy of people, a certain disinterest, a certain kind of retreat into private life, which is more and more happening today. And that's kind of the work I'm doing now for my next book project.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I did glean that you are working on the subject of apathy, and one can already see immediately a continuation from this question of ignorance, denial, to apathy. They're intimately related in my mind. So it makes very much sense that would be the next step.
Yeah, and it's also a very interesting subject, because there have been actually in the United States in the 50s quite a movement in favor of apathy. Because there were some ideas that democracy, in a way, is a system which allows you, let's say, not to vote, to retreat into your private life, and so on. So the political scientists who were praising apathy, of course, were quickly criticized that in a very divided society, usually it is only the lower class which is apathetic, and the upper classes, or those who are, racially much more advantageous, they are not apathetic at all to keep their power in their hands.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And, I was just thinking about what was it? It was before the Civil War, I believe, in the 1840s. There was a party in the United States called the Know Nothing Party. So they had very much a populist type of party. They weren't around for very long, but they pushed, all kinds of chauvinistic ideals and populist ideals of the sort of the worst sort. But it just, the fact that that's a part of our history, the Know Nothing Party, just really shows that these things, this question of ignorance in politics, this question of apathy it's been around. It's not anything necessarily new. It's just, transformed a little bit.
Yeah, I agree with you, and thanks for the information about this party.
That's something that's just popped into my head, thinking about all the different ways that ignorance, denial, and then apathy, because I think all three of those kind
disavowal,
of disavowal. Yeah. I mean, there's because that's what I was thinking about too, was the fact that when I know that you brought up, gosh, I'm trying to think. Well, I was thinking of some of the main principles of psychoanalysis, right? In the session with the analysand, the analyst, one of his principles is the evenly suspended attention, right? Not to focus on any one detail, not to focus on any one statement from the analysand. And so in a certain sense, there is a kind of frame that like I know Coop does filmmaking, and he's got that as part of his background. So he understands very specifically that you can't focus on everything. So there has to be kind of things outside the frame that one maybe ignores or doesn't pay as much attention to. But there's also in the demand to say anything that comes to mind, there's also this demand to ignore whether it be the superego or the inhibitive compulsion to stop from saying something. So there's a kind of, on that end, a type of ignorance. And then what was the third thing I had about, there was some other principle that I wanted to bring up, but those two at least are very much, and in just the negation essay, the fact of the symbol of negation, right, of denial endows thinking with a measure of freedom from the consequences of repression and the compulsion of the pleasure principle. So there's ignorance is very, in a certain clinical sense, important to Freudian technique, if that makes any sense.
Yes, absolutely. And great that you mentioned Freud's short but brilliant essay on negation, because he, in this essay, links negation to a kind of an idea of freedom, So he gives these examples that when in the discourse a patient negates something, saying the person in my dream is not my mother. That's his famous example, saying that she's not the mother. No one was saying, that the person is his mother. So he is in a way saying it, for the first time, the patient, by negating it. However, by doing this, he's opening up his patient, that's Freud's point, a possibility to move further, so he's uttering something that has not maybe in the discourse been uttered before, and maybe the next step of free associations will reveal something more about his relationship to the mother, or his emotions in regards to his mother. I think that it is very important to understand sort of these elements: negation, denial, ignorance in analytic setting in a variety of ways, because ignorance is also kind of on the side of the psychoanalyst who is in some way a person who is in the position that is supposed to know, the subject supposed to know. We call it in Kenyan psychoanalysis. However, he or she has to sort of remain in the position of, in a way, not knowing, not giving theories about, what is happening in the patient's life, and, being the one who bounces kind of questions back and allows the patient, to come to the knowledge which has maybe been, repressed, pushed aside, too traumatic to talk about, too traumatic to remember. And that's where, sort of ignorance plays an important part also on the side of the patient. And quite often, as I say in the book, it is things which are really, too painful to be put in the words that are something that we ignore. I give examples from, medicine, when we are facing some terrible, illness. Quite often we do everything kind of, let's say, to push it aside, not universally, but many people don't want to know. And it is, of course, difficult nowadays whether you want to know or not. Actually, myself, I was dealing practically with the question to know or not to know about sort of my genetic.
Right.
I was chosen in Slovenia to be one of the people who were asked to donate their blood so that they will analyze it for the kind of a genomic bank, which we are establishing. When I was dealing with this question, do I want to know or not? I was sort of naively thinking that if they do, the analysis of my genome, that they will inform me there are maybe potentially some illnesses lurking
right
in me. And so I had to kind of deal personally whether I want to know or not. And I've decided if they tell me, some uncomfortable information, I want to know it. But whenever I ask my students, do they want to know, let's say that we would now be able to have genetic tests which would sort of, let's say, predict us that painful illness like Alzheimer awaits. There are already some tests, but we still don't have anything like universally available. And, of course, most of the illnesses are not linked to one gene, but, a kind of interplay with genes and the environment. So it's very hard to make the prediction. But whenever I ask this kind of let's say, potential fantasy type of question at the moment, my students usually, they divide themselves into half and half. Half of the group would say, we want to know what awaits us. But the other half say, we don't want to know. Especially if an illness like Alzheimer awaits me, I don't want to know. And when I ask them, what's the reason for not knowing? Quite often they say love. But both groups bring love to the forefront, So the group which doesn't want to know would say, we will be afraid to fall in love, so we rather enjoy life, have lovers and so on without knowing what awaits us. And the others say, we want to know because we will love more. Now,
that's a good point.
Okay, yeah.
I don't want to know. I just want to put that out there for everyone that I don't want to know, because I don't want to have anxiety. I already have enough. I have too much anxiety as it is. So that's why I would rather remain ignorant. So I don't have to sit there and wait. But then again, I guess on the reverse of that is if you don't know, it's the unknown becomes all the more terrifying. So maybe I have it backwards. I'm not sure.
A lot of people want to know with the fantasy that they can do something, that they can change something, even if they can't. But there's this idea that maybe, we don't want to give up on the idea that we are subjects, that we can sort of change situation.
That drive to master would kick in. So, either way, I think that's the double bind, Coop, right? If you didn't know, you could be anxiety, you could dread the unknown, but then if you did know, then you would have all of this, you'd have a different problem. So I think
you would have to confront the real head on, and that's terrifying. Maybe that's why I don't want to do. I want to live in my little fantasy where I'm immortal and strong and handsome and good looking and smart.
But in regard to knowing and not knowing, one of the most puzzling things, which, I'm thinking quite a lot, which I tackle in the book, at the end of the book, is this question of, for example, when people know that something is false, like fake news or a conspiracy theory, but they are still sharing it, So this is like a kind of quite a challenge, I would say, that you are spreading something that you don't believe in.
Yes.
And nonetheless, you're spreading it. So at the end of the book, I'm mentioning research done by Danish-American social scientists who interviewed 6,000 passionate Twitter users, who are followers, a big following group. And they are like really passionately spreading, fake news and conspiracy theories. And when they interviewed them, they saw that a lot of these people don't believe in what they are sharing. Here, for me, the really big question was, what's the enjoyment in doing this? When you are not, believing in what you're sharing, that you must gain something. And I think that there are two gains. And one gain is recognition, is feeling that your group is then, retweeting, liking, and so on. And you're gaining, sort of kind of your audience, you're gaining. followers. And that is a satisfaction which people are craving in today's times. They, in the past, craved different type of satisfaction, but it's very similar still. The big other still functioning.
We want social prestige.
Exactly. Yes. It's, not so changed our relationship to big other today. And then the second enjoyment, I think, really jouissance in the Lacanian term is when the other group, let's say people who have opposite beliefs, maybe politically opposite or whatever opposite beliefs, are angry. When they respond, when they are outraged, then you get another recognition from the this anger and counterattacks that you gain with spreading something that you don't believe.
It's give me more love or more disdain. It's the indifference that's bad.
Indifference is the opposite of love or something like that.
Right. Yeah. The indifference is what they hate. Was what they hate. They crave the love or the disdain.
At least if you're hated, you're recognized, I think.
Yes.
Maybe, you know what I mean?
Yeah. That's why I bring together in the book these two terms, ignorance in the meaning of being ignored and ignorance in regard to knowledge, the relationship.
Right. Yeah.
The lack of knowledge.
Right. That's nice.
You had the wonderful Oscar Wilde quote, right? The worse than being talked about is not being talked about. I really appreciated that. That was great.
On Twitter, I spread bad interpretations of Lacan, but not knowingly though. It's unconscious.
Well, no, I mean, but a lot of times it's what we call shit posting, right? A lot of times it's a humorous take on a serious theoretical matter, which, if you think about Lacan's seminars, especially, he's not afraid to pun and to make these kind of convoluted jokes out of these theoretical difficulties in a way. So there is a sense in which Lacan too is, we can call it playing, we can call it shit posting, but there is a kernel of seriousness to it.
Yes, you are right. But he also, was a performer.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I so agree with this. He
liked to provoke, even with his dress code and, fur coats in the winter and so on.
Yeah, the fur coats. Yes. There's a great, is it Dali who he's with?
Coop? Yeah. There's a picture of him and Dali either getting into a limousine or getting out of one or something like that. It's great. Funny that you mentioned that, because I was thinking about, we just covered Seminar 20 a few weeks ago. And I mean, I loved the seminar. I thought it was a wonderful read, but I could see Lacan. He's almost like a Vegas performer at this point, like the Rat Pack, or like, you know what I mean? Like a Dean Martin almost.
Yes, I know. Yeah. There is a lovely film, Adieu Lacan, which was also, kind of done a few years ago.
Right.
Which the American director Richard Leeds did, like a low budget film. Yeah, where it was a good presentation of him in his eccentricities also of Lacan.
That's great. I do think that it's good here, since we're talking about Lacan. I was curious, and this is perhaps for our benefit a little bit, but for the audience, you draw the title of your book, A Passion for Ignorance, from one of his seminars, which I hadn't come across, but I think it is interesting because you go into sort of this idea that Lacan is gleaning from Buddhism, this kind of feeling. Do you want to maybe discuss that a little bit, the background, the context for the listener?
Yes, exactly. So, yes, I was curious, how did Lacan, come to this term passion for ignorance? Because, he mentions that people don't have a passion for knowledge, but rather a passion for ignorance. And then he describes it, that, people come to psychoanalysis with the idea they want to know what is causing their suffering, but then very quickly they close their eyes. They don't want to go near, their traumatic pasts or something, that is actually, very much linked to their pain. And I started looking into the history when Lacan started first using the term, and actually how did he come to this term. And then I realized that he was attending in the 50s at the Sorbonne lectures on Buddhism. And that time, there was a very famous Indian scholar of Buddhism, Valpula Rahula, who was also lecturing at Sorbonne, and, they were sort of studying his work. And I realized that actually Lacan picked it from Buddhism and kind of reinterpreted this term in his own work. So I think he kind of borrowed a passion for ignorance from Buddhism without really sort of, let's say, going kind of further into Buddhist discussions about ignorance. I think he did, this with some other philosophers too. He got influenced with something, and then he kind of, I would say, reused some terms. And I think that ignorance is one of these terms kind of reused by him, later on. And I think in a very good way, because I think that he tackles sort of the deadlock of psychoanalysis, where also in practice, psychoanalysis some sort of kind of gets stuck. And it's nice to maybe give an example to our listeners, and it will be an example not from Lacan, but from the work of Lacanian psychoanalyst Gérard Pommier in one of the books. I think it's something on the erotics and something. I forgot the title, which was published maybe 20 years ago, also in English translation. He gives an example of a patient who comes to see him with the strange problem. He was sort of kind of happily married, life was not, fantastically happy, but, he was married for 20 years, but kind of satisfied. And then suddenly this patient got the idea he wants to divorce. And he could not inform his wife that he wants to divorce. So in his head, he decided that he wants to divorce. Didn't really kind of know why, but he felt that he needs to do this. And the guy had a very strange kind of ritual with his mother. So although he was married for 20 years, every weekend, he was taking his dirty laundry to his mother to wash it. And she prepared, the washed laundry, everything properly ironed, So she was doing all this stuff for him every weekend. And, finally, when he was in analysis discussing why he cannot inform his wife that he will divorce her, he said to the analyst, "This weekend, I will tell my mother that I'm going to get divorced." And then when he heard himself saying this, he realized that he's going to divorce his mother and not his wife. That he wants to change something in this, strange bond, emotional bond, and also that's a dirty laundry type of bond that he had with his mother. So we see that psychoanalytic setting opened up for this man a possibility to hear himself differently.
Right.
I'm going to divorce, I'm going to get a divorce, was suddenly put in a different context. So his kind of, let's say, knowledge in regards to the kind of the traumatic relationship he was working on with his mother suddenly came to the forefront. And, of course, there was no need to divorce his wife, which is why he couldn't utter these words to her.
I think that's fascinating. It does point to that, again, that role that the analyst would play in the analytic discourse as, kind of, whatever you want to call it, objective neutrality or a blank mirror, instead of sort of, and I think this is why Freud didn't want to face his patients, right, to influence them. But if there is this blank mirror and not sort of, and we're not mimicking the other and not putting on or imposing or posing as, something that we think they want, but we have this blank reflection coming back, then we're able to see ourselves perhaps in a different light in that setting.
Exactly. And of course, now, the question is, what has changed in psychoanalysis when a lot of analysis is now done online or, on telephone? Zoom and so on. We just had a conference in Vienna a few weekends ago at the Vienna Psychoanalytic Organization. And, they were kind of debating this, whether something has, radically changed. A lot of the old-fashioned psychoanalysts still felt that, having a person physically present and on the couch is really an important element, in psychoanalysis, which is why some of the old-fashioned Viennese psychoanalysts, even today, don't want to use the new technologies. But, people are traveling, moving, patients are nowadays living, abroad, working remotely, and so on, which is why quite a lot of psychoanalysts have accepted, the new technology as an adequate way to do analysis in today's times.
I think I would want to be, both as an analyst and an analyst, I would want to be in the room on either side of that, I think. I really want to be, I think that context is important, something about maybe the ability, the setting for the free association. Like, I feel like it's almost, well, I was going to say it's almost like I started to think about maybe that's too much like the confessional booth type relationship. So maybe that's a bad,
It kind of is though, right?
But yes. I feel like, I don't know, something about the context, I think, opens up the subject. If you're within your bedroom talking to your analyst, I don't know. I think that's a different, that is a different animal.
A different transference, right?
Yeah, totally. An unmediated, mediated versus unmediated transference. How does that even work? Because you're not able to pick up on like the nonverbal cues as much, even like noises or bodily, movements as intricately. So.
That's true, but at the same time, with the pandemic and lockdown.
Right, yes. Yeah. I mean, pragmatically, it makes a lot of sense too. I just feel like, there's something could be lost there.
I agree, but I think that we need to be opened up about the possibilities, the new technologies, and especially I think after COVID-19, the possibility that there might be new events like this. It's good if people have the possibility to talk to someone, even if it is only with the help of the screen. And by the way, we are also now discussing
right, yeah, exactly,
across the ocean.
That's true. I mean, you're right. There is a sense in which the technologies, for whatever drawbacks they may have from the original conception of the psychoanalytic setting, it's a tool in the toolbox that can and should be used when possible and sometimes when necessary. And of course, as you mentioned, this type of format makes what we do possible. And so, I'm going to be take the neutral side, that I can see both senses. And I do think it's interesting just on this topic. I was kind of thinking more about analysis and ignorance. And one of the things that we've been talking about in the past few interchanges is this idea that resistance to not only, of the ego, let's say, or the conscious to working through repression, but even to psychoanalysis, there's something about resistance that on the one hand is an obstacle to working through and the cure, but is also perhaps can be a lever and a means and a tool with which to work with, because the resistances to the cure, to the working through, to the session itself seems to be the point upon which to, put pressure or to investigate further. I guess my question is, do you see how that then, resistance to not knowing, if you will, is perhaps one of the key features of any analytic treatment?
The resistance to knowing, I think probably, resistance to come too close to what is maybe the core of your symptom. And I think that very skilled psychoanalysts are able to easily deal with this resistance. Sometimes, of course, nowadays, I would say because of the possibility to move psychoanalysis online, the resistance might be, linked to the fact that, people, even when they have the possibility to work online, find ever new obstacles of, why they cannot. Sometimes even with the idea that the technology is not working or whatever. That I'm seeing this also with my students sometimes when I ask them to kind of, let's say, show their face. If I'm teaching online, half of the computers are not working or the cameras are not working.
Interesting.
Yes. So I feel it's like we use, whatever tools we have for our resistance in psychoanalysis and, otherwise.
That makes a lot of sense. What I was thinking about earlier was with mastery and with the analyst as the subject supposed to know, you're coming to the analyst thinking he's going to know the answers, right? And Lacan kind of forefronting this as perhaps a bad model, because I think that, and Freud had this idea too, I think that if it were as easy as sort of just telling the patient back to them, here's what's wrong with you, here's your symptom, here's what you're repressing, it's your mother, it's your father, etc. If it were just enough to give the knowledge, kind
That's
of like
a good point, yeah.
Kind of like Freud says, if it's when the analyst says it's not my mother, even if repression has lifted a little bit because of the symbol of negation, that's not yet working through the issue. So it's not enough to This is, I think, why he moved away from suggestion and hypnosis, because it's not enough. There has to be more done to associatively link up these repressions. And so I guess that's the interesting thing for me is that breaking through ignorance is just one of the first steps, right?
Okay. It's not enough to just, we know and we understand that capitalism is bad, but we can't work through it yet.
We know very well, and yet there's still more work to be done than just knowing, which is why I think someone like Socrates, who sometimes it feels like he's saying people don't knowingly do the wrong thing. And yet with psychoanalysis, we can see that that's not such an easy ethical statement to make. So this question of ignorance becomes, involved in a more elaborate process, I suppose.
In Lacanian analysis, for example, of obsessional neurosis, you see, kind of knowledge presented often in the discourse. An obsessional will, for example, explain, everything in the words to the analyst, what he thinks or she thinks is wrong in his or her life, maybe in detail describe, the conflict with some, parental figure and so on. But kind of explaining everything, putting everything in words and, sort of kind of dealing with it are two separate things, because the person will not link his or her affects to the discourse that he or she is presenting, so it will be as if he or she is speaking about someone else. As if, the story that he is giving, an explanation which might be totally plausible, does not concern the patient, him or herself. And that's where, Lacan says that in obsessional neurosis, sometimes you need to even, introduce a little bit of kind of a shaking up, like sometimes even a little bit of anxiety or something, kind of perturb that detachment, that the person is able, this kind of a charade, the person is presenting, maybe a perfect theory or story, and does not kind of deal with the affect emotions that are really operating behind, so that's kind of pushed aside, which is very different than with the hysteric, who will be quite often, sort of constantly searching for the master, hoping to get an answer from the analyst, or provoking, the analyst, making maybe some drama. And, it is very important that the psychoanalyst kind of differently reacts in both cases.
This is wonderful that you brought up the difference between the obsessional and the sort of detachment from affect versus the hysteric who's constantly pushing for the production of knowledge. It's as though the hysteric, wants this production, which is why what Lacan later links it to sort of the movement of science, right? It's constantly wanting to know and wanting to produce some sort of knowledge, versus the obsessional who perhaps wants to be seen as the source of knowledge. Is that right? Is there something about the obsessional wanting to be seen as producing all of these links, but and yet not affectively connecting them?
Yes, in some way. And also, let's say quite often an obsessional might be a workaholic who kind of appears as if, he's just following some master who is constantly demanding from him to work more and more. But actually, it is the obsessional himself who is master, who is imposing constantly, let's say, new tasks, so that, he doesn't come close to something that is too much for him. Maybe, the woman he really wants to come close to, but, he's afraid that coming too close to the object of his desire will annihilate, will be the end of his subjectivity, which is why he needs to have ever new obstacles, like too much work or whatever. There is, again, a very nice example of it it's from the 80s. There was an Argentinian psychoanalyst who wrote, Indart was his name, in one of the French Ornicar, the Lacanian journals, a little vignette about his patient who was very much in love with one woman. And at that time, the phone lines didn't work too well. We didn't have mobile phones yet then, but the normal lines didn't work too well in Argentina. So the person was waiting for the woman he adored to call him. But he was constantly picking up the phone to check if the phone line is working or not. But doing this, he was preventing demanding the woman to call him.
Right.
After waiting like 2 days and constantly picking up, he collapsed and he ended up in psychoanalysis,
Oh, wow. I also think fondly of the Ratman case, where he kind of sets up this whole elaborate puzzle, if you will, with some forgetting on one side and some, obviously different forms of repression, this whole charade to sort of embroil himself and prevent himself from getting close to the object of desire, as you said. That makes very much sense, that obsessionality. I can see it. And that's kind of what you say in the chapter on love, where you kind of point out that there is a sense in which, if you will, the chase is more seductive or more intense than actually getting the object of desire. That's perhaps the last thing they want, is actually the object of their desire turning their attention to them. It's more about this obsessional mode.
Yeah, when I'm praising ignorance in love, so that in romantic love, it's important, to keep closing your eyes and not try to see too much.
You had a great footnote where you break down what Lacan's triangle of ignorance, love, and hate, in their relation to the symbolic, real, and imaginary. But it does make sense that the way you were working it out, that in love, there may be this move towards the other as a total object, whereas the pervert has it easy, right? The pervert just wants a part and not the whole. So they don't really need usually to go into analysis. They're quite happy just to have a little piece that facilitates things. But that's not the case for in terms of love, which requires this screen of fantasy, or this ability, as you said, to kind of not see certain things, or at least to see them in refracted, so to speak.
Yeah, but which is why, for a partner of the pervert, it's always complicated. Let's say if someone has a perverse sort of, let's say, attachment to a particular kind of a fetish, let's say high heels, and the woman who has high heels, would be, for him, something very, enjoyable to watch or do something else. But like, as soon as she doesn't have high heels, she loses, the aura. And for the partner, for this woman, might be very traumatic, to understand the importance of the fetishist object, which sort of means that she's kind of secondary to the object, Pervers is not interested in her per se, which might be very hard to deal with if you are in this kind of a relationship.
This is making me think there has to be some Lacanian essay on Cinderella and the slipper. There has to be some sort of, writing on the magical fetishistic slipper that turned Cinderella into the princess. But that's just off the top of my head. If it hasn't been written, somebody needs to go write that. I would doubt it hasn't been written about.
Definitely. And of course, there have been interesting studies on the shoes and the fashion and psychoanalysis. Quite a number of texts and books.
Coop, I definitely want you to come in. I'm just going through some of my questions and hogging the show. But there was one other thing before I hand it off. So I'll let you start thinking, Coop, about which one of your questions you want to ask. There was I believe it's in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, after World War I, Freud has this kind of big turn in 1920. I say turn, it turns towards the later work where it's his most speculative work, but at the forefront, he's talking about dreams from some of the soldiers that return from the war and their anxiety dreams and how they're sort of reliving this trauma. And he's confronted with the idea that perhaps his initial sort of declaration that all dreams are, involve wish fulfillment. He's wondering, what is the wish that's being fulfilled in these recurring nightmares? And it's, he supposes that the anxiety induced in the dream is this means of sort of retroactively preparing anxiety as a defense for the traumatic events of war. And I'm wondering then if this, when what he calls a drive to master through anxiety, if this is a drive to sort of master the ignorance before the event, after the fact, this not Träglichkeit, if you will, this après coup, this deferred action of retroactively mastering the ignorance of the horrors of war or something.
No, Freud speaks quite similar things twice in his work, actually, in regard to the train crash. He, let's say, imagines that people have suffered, have been victims in a train crash, and then after, some of them start developing nightmares. And his idea is that in this nightmare, people are sort of like reliving the anxiety related to the train crash, but it is as if this anxiety tries to prepare them if a repetition of this event is happening, in the future. So, which is what Freud's idea is, that anxiety can function like a buffer zone. It tries to prepare us for something, but it comes, after the event, so as if, it would help us before the event to have the knowledge what is to happen, what is to come, which is, of course, impossible. That's where anxiety, becomes, again, something, potentially quite positive, or at least, we have a fantasy that we might be able, with the help of anxiety, to be prepared for trauma, which is to come.
I do like that. And I think that Lacan later talks about, in seminar 10, about anxiety as a kind of a signal from the real to the ego. And so there's something similar there too about this preparedness, this buffer.
Absolutely. And of course, anxiety, which I wrote a book about it a few years ago, it's something also very important in love and in intersubjective relationships as such, because desire and the question of, how are we desired by others is an anxiety-provoking question. And also, the whole question about the subject, the identity, how was I, let's say, conceived? Was I desired or not by my parents?
Right.
It's like an essential question for people to which there is no answer. And Colette Soler gives a wonderful kind of explanation that, to those kind of anxiety-provoking questions of who am I for the other? How does the other regard me? It's very painful to understand that there is no way we can ever find any satisfying answer. Even, let's say, that if I ask my partner, do you love me? Who am I for you? And let's say he would say, I love you, and you are, the best that happened to me, or whatever. I would look in between the lines, I would sort of try to figure out whether the tone of his voice, is honest, or maybe he's just trying to escape, this stupid question, wants to move on with something more interesting to discuss. So there is no answer that can satisfy us to those kind of questions in regards to, who are we in the desire of the other? And of course, the other cannot put that into words also.
I like this because you say this in your essay on the drive, quoting Soler, right? The other can't provide the answer because the series of signifiers can never fully represent the subject, but can only represent him or her for another signifier. But there's also the lack in the other, right? For Lacan, it's supposed to understood as the interval, right? The subject himself can't give the answer because of being castrated or split. So you're right. There is no way to really find this out, which is why I think it constantly recurs. And it recurs through your book too as a trope, this what am I for the other, which is this sort of existential, anxiety-provoking question. Yet at the same time, it's, as you said, it's positive in provoking that anxiety. I mean, like the way maybe Sartre talks about angst, as sort of we're condemned to be free, if you will. Anyway, that was just an aside. Not a question, just I'm glad you brought up that point because I did enjoy your essay on the drive, and I highly recommend it for our listeners to track that down if they're curious about the drive and Freud and Lacan.
Thank you.
Coop, I know you had some stuff. I'll
I don't know that I necessarily have a formulated question per se, but maybe more of like a provocation to conversation would be, I don't know, this morning I started to think, and just reviewing my notes, how well this sort of idea of ignorance applies to something like film. And I know Taylor mentioned that a little, a bit earlier in the podcast. But I think it is interesting going to the example from Levi-Strauss and how there's a village, there's two different kinship groups, and each of them represented the layout of the village, let's say, of the village space differently. And so that's kind of the germ of the idea that triggered this. Okay, well, something similar, or maybe more so drawing the relationship between the power lies with who decides what's emphasized. And I think that example from Levi-Strauss goes to that. But I think maybe the filmmaker would be the sort of, you know what I mean? It's kind of like the omniscient position, the eye of God in a sense that selects, and even just in the construction of film too, the importance of ignorance, because it's really just a series of images. It's not this, it's an illusion, you know what I mean? It's just static images being shown at a particular speed. So we sort of are ignorant of that process, but we're also ignorant of just the way that the language of film, the way that cuts work, etc. It's not necessarily this thing that you would perhaps understand without being immersed within the milieu of cinematic language, which, you know, is a good metaphor. I don't know if you have any, if this draws out any thoughts relative to this example of the village and representation and the different methods and how ignorance plays into that, perhaps.
No, I think that you're right that this story by Claude Lévi-Strauss, and I think it's important to remind our listeners that it is about he studying a village in South America where there are two native groups, kind of sub-tribes of one tribe living together, but each of the group draws the village completely differently. They live in the same village, but one group draws as if the houses are like placed in a circular way, and the other one draws this village as if they are kind of more in a square type of way. And he says that even if we look at this village with the new technology, let's say take an aerial photo of the village, maybe we will see something completely different from the two tribes. Maybe the village is like in a triangular way or whatever set. And I think that Claude Lévi-Strauss nicely points out that people actually construct the structure of their reality or their, you know, the theory of how their reality looks like in a highly individual way. And there is no universal sort of, let's say, picture, and we cannot convince them even, let's say, with a kind of, let's say, picture from afar that their story of how they see their realities is wrong. And we see this more and more. Let's say we have such divided communities in the United States. It is that the Republicans and Democrats are seeing their own country in a completely different way. It is like these two tribes of Claude Lévi-Strauss, or let's say people who believe that the world is flat. They cannot be convinced with any aerial photos about the earth being round, because they have already made the theory in their heads in which they believe. And I think that it's important to understand, you know, the power of these beliefs. And this is where, you know, kind of my study of ignorance also goes into that. In today's times, whichever new technologies we have, we actually are opening ever new doors of how to interpret the knowledge that we have, how to close our eyes, let's say, in front of the knowledge, and also how to limit knowledge. And that's another point I want to make, that, you know, we are often saying that we are living in the knowledge-based society, but actually we are living in ignorance-based societies, because we are finding ways to limit scientific knowledge, for example, to, you know, only a small groups of people. And nowadays, let's say with big data, whoever has access to the big data, and these are private corporations, you know, especially Google, Facebook, Amazon, and similars, they have now an important asset, which, you know, the majority of the people around the world don't have access to. So we are living in society where, unfortunately, knowledge, you know, especially scientific knowledge and new knowledge that we are creating out of the new, let's say, studies of the big data, the secret algorithms, the way they work, the way they influence our behavior, political, consumer, and other, how they influence our emotions. I think all this is becoming now so obscured and so privatized, and, you know, in some way so hard to study, even in the domain of science, that this is kind of, let's say, the new world of ignorance, which we still, I think, don't really know how to tackle. Unfortunately, I feel even in the domain of science that we are really limiting access to scientific development, with the way, scientific publishing is functioning,
Right.
the difficulty with open access, the difficulty, let's say, having the possibility to study data. And also, I would say, the compartmentalization of knowledge, which is sort of kind of really linked to the economic power structures. The big corporations, which are, in charge of all the data more and more.
Right.
And
Yeah.
there's no way to get out of it. Let's say
Yeah.
the Cambridge Analytica scandal is almost forgotten. It showed an enormous influence that Facebook can have on the emotions, on political beliefs of people. And we didn't make any step, let's say, further after that scandal.
I like how you emphasize in the discussion in the book about this, something I find very interesting. I don't know, just maybe for its metaphorical value would be this idea that, let's say, even if you as an individual requested your data, you wouldn't really be able to do anything with it outside. Like you need the rest of the data set to really be able to utilize. So even, I don't know, it's just kind of showing how much of our sort of subjectivity or just how sort of controlled we are, I suppose.
Exactly, but also how we close our eyes. So when I was writing this book before the pandemic, when I was sort of finishing some of the chapters, I went to Ukraine, to Kiev, where they translated one of my book on choice. And I noticed how in Kiev, everywhere internet is free. Like walk down the main streets and like you have the signal, sort of like you can connect to internet wherever you want. And I gave a lecture and I asked my audience, whether they are worried about the fact that this data is collected by someone. And who is collecting data from the fact that like everyone can be on internet, wherever. And, my audience were completely ignorant, like which data, who cares about, our data, our data is like nothing for anyone, sort of like we just want to have free internet and that's fine that we have. So it's kind of a small thing, but like, today, we are really living with this forced choice that either we kind of, let's say, allow our data and not know what is happening with it, or we are not having access to all kinds of apps or, internet as such.
I mean, that's a good point. Just the fact that our GPS locations with our phones on can be accessed, even just something as simple as that could have wide-ranging implications for, not just obviously corporations, but state executive,
social movements.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, you
don't want to take your phone to a protest, let's say, even for example.
Exactly. So that's what I was trying to do in this book, to look at the issues of ignorance, knowledge, subjectivity in today's time, So to move also psychoanalytic thinking a little bit further. And that's what I think we need to do, to bring together people who are working in psychoanalysis, social sciences, philosophy, and also who understand new technology, to kind of understand subjectivity today. That's kind of, let's say, my idea. And there are more and more people actually who are seeing this need. And there is an institute established now in New York, Pulsion, which I'm also linked to, which is planning to, train future psychoanalysts, but in instead of a broader way, to look at the social changes and how the social changes are affecting individuals. That's kind of my question, which I always pose my friends. I'm not a practicing psychoanalyst myself, but whenever I speak with my friends who are, I ask them, what are the new symptoms today? What are the type of suffering that you observe today? Is there any change?
Interesting.
Today and like maybe 20, 30 years ago when you started practicing. And there are some changes and not so many at the same time. Sufferings are quite similar. Nonetheless, there are, definitely new elements today. I would say that this element of sort of a kind of a apathy or burnout or, a disaffected also subject. Especially among youngsters, having problem to put into words your emotions, your affects, they observe on the rise. And with those who are working with children, of course, they do observe change that is happening with children because they are hooked so early to new technologies, who are very used of holding mobile phones in their hands, and they are maybe 1 or 2 years old, and they are not accustomed to eat without some entertainment.
Oh gosh.
Yes.
They want to, they swipe with their hand, in the air when they want to get rid of some human being, as they swipe with their hand on their mobile phone,
That's hilarious.
What psychiatrists who are working and psychologists who are working with small children are observing is also that when they get very accustomed to this, lively images, films on the mobile phones and computers early on, nothing in actual life can compare to that. Nothing is exciting.
Right. Yeah.
That's the dynamic online.
Even the real experience, just thinking about people that share photographs on Instagram because of the filters and so forth. And I mean, it's not limited to Instagram, obviously, but the image is more real than the real, to get too much in a boat drawer. But I wanted to bring it back to this idea of the apathy or burnout that you brought up, because this is something that I feel a lot. And it's just that, for example, I may see a dead squirrel or something on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
Then I empathize with the suffering of the animal, but then I start to think, oh, well, there's this, how many times is this happening? And it becomes this overwhelming thing. And I mean, that's just like a squirrel. I mean, the Ukraine war is another thing. Obviously there's innocent people that are dying on both sides of the conflict. What can I do to actually impact that and help those people? There's very little that I can do. And that's only one example. Obviously, that's a prime example because it's in the media, but there's, a million untold stories. And so when I start to project that, it almost makes me sick that there's so much suffering that I'm powerless to do anything about. So the fantasy retreat is a way of, it's totally what the book is about, is like, I want to remain ignorant of this suffering so that I can just live my life
so you can function.
So that I can even function without just being crushed every day by the absolute suffering of all life.
I think that's kind of the next step of where, neoliberalism is kind of, succeeding. So in my previous book, Tyranny of Choice, I was, looking at that this idea that everything in your life is a matter of choice is, on the one hand, a total fantasy, but on the other hand, it's kind of a productive fantasy, which allows the neoliberal regime to continue to go on, because you are constantly dealing with, did I do the right thing? Should I take longer? You're full of anxiety, full of feeling of guilt, and you're constantly blaming yourself, and that's ideal subject for neoliberalism. I think it's your individual choices which matter, and not social choices, which means that you are not politically active, to kind of organize yourself as a group. And I think that apathy is like the next step in this passivization, and also this retreat, which is happening more and more because there is really so much excitation, so much horror, so many, terrible things happening. So this retreat to the private life, I observe more and more, people not watching the news, closing the television down when there is another conflict they are reading about. Of course, we knew already before. Stanley Cohen, he was a professor at LSE, wrote a book about denial, where he 20 years ago analyzed compassion fatigue in regard to wars, saying that, people sooner or later get just completely exhausted and stop watching or stop kind of noticing all the suffering that they observe. And we are observing this with Ukrainian war. And Zelensky even, himself a few months ago mentioned, please, in regard to our war, don't get into compassion fatigue, please listen what's happening and so on. And I think he was right. And he's doing, I think, a good job in reminding constantly, the world what is happening, because otherwise, people will sooner or later just perceive it as another conflict that is going to go on forever. for all the years that the Syrian war was going on.
Right. I mean, still, it's still going on, basically.
And now the earthquake and, another catastrophe.
Exactly, yeah.
So yes, we need to understand that people are retreating into their private world or the fantasy world, which brings a certain kind of a satisfaction, enjoyment. Other people find a kind of a compensation for all the, pain that they are suffering from, or others are suffering and they are observing in the actual world. And we also, of course, need to understand that the logic of functioning of the neoliberal capitalism with the cruelty against the workers has contributed vastly to this feeling of burnout. And of course, the feeling that you are not recognized, that you are dispensable.
Exactly,
which
yeah.
I'm linking in the book also to the way, we are dealing with knowledge. So the feeling that you are ignored in some way affects you in how you are dealing with sort of knowledge and how you are also communicating, I would say, with others. Sometimes, finding enjoyment in spreading fake news in which even you yourself don't believe.
I would say this is you just beautifully, I think, executed the logic for why something like superhero films are so prevalent or popular in our current moment, because it allows a couple of things. It allows you to feel like to take on that individual power and strength and ability, the fantasy of yourself as you would like to be recognized as a superhuman or whatever the case may be. But it's also, on the other side of it, there's like a world that makes sense as well. Like the stories wrap themselves up nicely. Obviously, the good guys, triumph in the end. So I don't know, there's some tie between the sort of like individualistic aspect of neoliberalism and this individual fantasy, and as well as this like sort of fantasy of the social relation, maybe even.
Yeah, I'm just watching the Last of Us.
Oh yeah.
HBO series, so I see. I'm only on the second episode, but I already see it's again the individual who appears to be saving the world.
Exactly.
It is a kind of Messiah story. I've played there's 2 games now. I've played both of them, and I mean, you could say that there is this one central character who supposedly is going to save the world, but in another sense, I mean, the way the story plays out, there is, especially in the second game, there's a lot more social conflict and background to what's going on. So I'm hoping that the series does the stories in the game justice. And I think, go ahead, Coop.
I was going to say, this is why I love Dune, because Dune is specifically a critique of this way of thinking, this sort of individual savior mythology that, you know what I mean? I don't know. Something about that almost traps us in this double bind of action, right? Because it's like, I can't do anything by myself, but I don't have a group to participate in. So I'm caught within this double bind. But also, I guess just the notion that the whole Messiah, that idea itself, I think, is falling into the sort of fallow logocentric logic of, just that logic, you know what I mean? Ultimately, if you're looking for the exception, the exceptional one, like a Superman, for example, right? Like that's why the fantasy is so successful, I think.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to see where it's leading, because I did not play the game, but it appears that it's one of the rare films, made after the game that is quite successful.
I know that we've had you for about an hour and a half. I know we've talked a little bit about what you're working on now, Apathy, and linking this to your other works. I just want to give you perhaps a chance to tell us a little bit more about your current research and the overall arc. I'm hoping or thinking that you'll continue the kind of thread, because I see a thread in your books that logically sort of tie together. And, one of the things I'm thinking is I'm trying to juxtapose apathy versus something like equanimity, or, in the Epicurean sense or something like this, so that there can be positive aspects, kind of like with ignorance, right? I mean, perhaps there's an alternative, but I'll let you have the last word, just sort of telling us what we can see from you in the future.
Thank you. That is sort of like a line I'm following, because whichever theme I start researching, I want to kind of show many dimensions of it and not go kind of for or against, which is what, I did again, my book, Love and Hate, which was exactly, like showing how they quite often go hand in hand, and in anxiety also to show the kind of also positive aspects of anxiety with choice, also to not to give up on choice, but to see how wrongly we perceive choices nowadays, especially when we have this fantasy of a rational choice, when you can be satisfied with whatever you are choosing. And with ignorance, again, to show the positive elements of ignorance, the fact that sometimes it is very beneficial for the subject to be ignorant, to close his or her eyes, and to allow also someone else who is ignorant, let's say a person who is facing terrible illness and does not want to know about it, to allow the person to know how much he or she can kind of cope with, to have a respect for this kind of, let's say, ignorance related to trauma, some traumatic, let's say, past, or let's say something that awaits us. And now with apathy, I'm trying to also show the mechanisms, the social mechanisms, which are contributing to people feeling apathy. Also, to show how in different cultural settings this happens. For example, I'm looking at the Soviet and post-Soviet part of the world, and how it differs, if it does differ, the apathy in these countries which had different past than in the countries which have been in the capitalist system for a long time, how capitalism capitalizes on apathy. And a lot of regimes nowadays, I think, really quite kind of profit from having more and more people apathetic. And of course, I also to see with apathy also some, let's say, positive part of it. And in some way also juxtapose it to the kind of a search for excitation, which can be sometimes also, incredibly damaging for the person. And of course, it's also promoted ideologically, but differently than apathy. And I will look at the new technology, how the new technology is contributing to people being disaffected, but also sometimes, really, going into an overdrive of excitation, how to live with two extremes.
That's great. And it does, again, follow from the thread that I'm seeing in your work. And so I'm glad to see you continuing that and continuing that narrative and that trajectory. And I just want to say once again, I thank you so much for spending time with us today. I enjoyed it immensely getting to talk shop with you about Lacan, Freud, psychoanalysis, and the themes of your latest work. And I do look forward to your next work.
Thank you to both of you. And I'm looking forward to hearing more of your podcasts.
Excellent. We'll let you know. It should be
next weekend, Saturday or Sunday, hopefully.
Next weekend,
send me the link.
I will. I'll definitely do that.
Thank you.
If you need testimonials, I am totally your perfect subject for many of these conditions I have.
For apathy.
I've also tweeted probably 200 times in a day before. I don't know that for a fact, but I would say the probability is highly likely that I've done that before. So.
There you go.
I've got all kinds of fun neuroses that you could mine for your work.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a great
Pleasure
day.
having you. Thanks so much, Renata.
Bye.
Thanks again to Renata Salecl for joining us on this week's edition of The Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. To the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people as in Clockwork Orange.